to put it more simply, it was a gap between the intelligence gatherers and the potential users of that intelligence.
Yes.
But as your report points out, the CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Services, and the way they had been, withholding a lot of information from the Royal, Mounted Police of Canada, which meant that potentially there was a total coordination of efforts, that were being a lot of leads which were, being dished out by the perpetrators of this crime went unheeded and unnoticed. So these things, 26 years down the lane, do you think that kind of coordination still, the lack of coordination still does exist?
Well, something that is worth mentioning is that CSIS was in its first year of operation. They weren't staffed properly. Their staff came mainly from the RCMP, who could go for 2 years and then go back to the RCMP. The RCMP was a little resentful of losing national security, and they weren't particularly friendly with the people that joined CSIS. The people that joined CSIS were going into an organization that had not yet been organized. And to give you an example, in Surrey, where a lot of the activity were going on, there was nobody that could speak Punjab, Hindu. The police were white and could be spotted a mile away, and they had wiretaps, but nobody understood the wiretap until they sent it to Ottawa to be translated.
Your report also points out that the kind of, on the lapses that you're pointing out, the people in the CSIS would not be able to differentiate a one turban Sikh from the other. When you have such a, fundamental sense of, lack of understanding about the kind of subjects that you're dealing with, and then there are very solid, evidences, like one the intelligence said James Bartleman's, crucial evidence was ignored by a lot of investigators, over all these 20 years. So all these things, they point out to a further bigger concern that was this tragedy underestimated after it had happened also, in terms of the fact that the governments were accountable to the people in terms of bringing the culprits to the book of law?
I think one of the problems, I've mentioned it before, the RCMP, who were in charge of the investigation, didn't have a crime scene. Ordinarily, a police officer finds a corpse and he can go from there. Here, the plane was at the bottom of the ocean.
But that's the nature of the tragedy. I mean,
yes,
you will not be able to find debris.
Of course it is. But it was the largest crash of its kind into the ocean.
At that point in time?
At that point in time. And as a matter of fact, I think it still may be the biggest loss of life in a single plane accident. But in any event, to be kind, I don't think they knew where to start in the investigation. They denied that it was a bomb and kept saying it had to be mechanical failure. And in fact, you had an inquiry here, Justice Kirpal, that dealt mainly with the aircraft. So for the first 8 years, the government was denying liability until they were shown that they were at fault. I may have mentioned in my report that.
What did you interpret this denial on part of the government to accept it per se as an act of terror, as an act of sabotage?
Yeah, well, I comment on it. I say that the fishermen, the Irish and English who rescued bodies, could tell from the smell that it was a bomb, or at least an explosion. But when you get into government, they turn it over to the civil litigation, and you get into what's close to insurance type settlements, and they're never generous in their initial offer. And then they had no evidence. They felt they had no evidence.
And being a first of its kind accident, it was very, very difficult for the agencies to cope up with the kind of investigations that could have happened.
That's right. Now they made a settlement of sorts with the families of the victims and hoped it would go away. But it seemed to haunt the Canadian conscience all these years, what did happen. And of course, the families maintained their concern, what happened. And different governments would say it had been investigated. Finally, Prime Minister Harper was the first Prime Minister to see that it needed an inquiry. So that's where the inquiry started. Prior to